Hello and welcome back to the EV Life podcast. I'm your host, Krystal Maharaj, and I'm joined by Allison Bench, our producer.
Hi, happy to be here.
Yeah, for our final episode.
Yes, this is a special episode. This is the last episode of season 2 of AMA's EV Life podcast.
And we decided to do something a little bit different for this episode.
Yeah, you know, we wanted this episode to be a nice kind of wrap up for the season and also touch on kind of some of the main things that we know everybody is interested in.
Yeah, and so we had the opportunity in September to go out to AMA's car care events. So if you've been a member with AMA for a while, you know that we do these annual car care events where you can come and get your car sort of checked up. It's a 30-point inspection for winter. And so Allison and I were there in Edmonton, Red Deer, and Calgary talking to people who were attending about EVs.
Yeah, it was such a great opportunity for us to just be out there and meeting our members. And we met some people who had listened to the podcast, and we met some people who had never heard of it. So it was a great way to connect and hear directly what people are wondering about EVs.
Yes. Yeah. So that's what we really wanted to find out, what questions people had about EVs. And because obviously we want to bring you content that you're interested in hearing. And so what better way to do that than to just get out and talk to our members and hear what's on their minds when it comes to EVs.
Yeah. And so when we were at these car care events, we had our portable recorder with us, and we, as members would come by our booth, we gave them the opportunity to ask a question that they maybe want us to answer on the podcast.
Yeah. So how about we take a listen to our first question? And this one comes from Rob at our Edmonton car care event.
Hi, my name's Rob. I'm at the AMA Edmonton event. My question is, what are the concerns or issues that I might experience with an EV in winter in living in Edmonton and in Canada?
So the short answer to that question is yes, you will see some range loss in winter, but driving around cities and day to day, like commuting to work, it shouldn't really be noticeable.
Yeah. And if you would recall, if you listened from season 1, we spoke to Annette Burve with the Norwegian Auto Federation in episode 4. And the Norwegian Auto Federation performs EV range testing twice a year, including one in winter conditions. And that test has been conducted since 2020. So they have quite a few years of data. And they've repeatedly found that range loss really varies depending on the car, but it can be up to 32% less than the advertised range of the vehicle.
Like when you buy a vehicle, it'll say the estimated range for a full charge. And so they're finding that, but you know, it says they do the 32% is kind of the max loss that they have.
Right. That's
and I think
the
some
most
of them
they've seen.
Yeah. Some of them are a lot lower. Like I know that some of them are below 10% loss. So it really does depend on the vehicle. But one tip that Burve did give us during that episode was that if you preheat your vehicle before you drive while it's still plugged in and charging, that can be a big game changer.
Right. Because again, your vehicle is pulling from that battery to heat your car up. And so if you're preheating it while it's still plugged in, then obviously once you're on the road, you're using less of the battery.
Let's take a little listen to what kind of tips she had for that.
You will lose more range the colder it gets. So it's really important to kind of use the EV to its fullest potential, meaning that you preheat it before you drive, so that you use electricity from the grid to heat up the battery, heat up your driving environment, so that you don't use your main battery on actually heating up your car. So you just preheat as much as you can. That keeps the consumption lower, meaning that you at least get a little bit more range.
That was Annette Burve. And again, if you want to hear that full interview with the Norwegian Auto Federation, take a listen to season 1, episode 4 to hear the full interview, including NAF's cold weather EV testing and how those cars did handle the winter weather.
So another topic that is really popular when it comes to EVs is the EV road trip. So let's hear this question from AMA member Colleen.
I'm Colleen, and my questions about EV are, if I want to drive to Vancouver, will I have any concerns about being charged at all times? And that's probably the only place that I would do that.
So we have heard from multiple EV users who've taken road trips that a Canadian road trip, whether it's going west or it's going east, is completely doable. But, there is work to be done in terms of infrastructure, because it's easy to find a gas station. It's not as easy to find a charging station.
Mm-hmm. You'll definitely have to do a bit more planning. But that said, again, we've talked to people who have gone from Edmonton to Vancouver or Edmonton to Toronto, and they've all been able to do it with very few hiccups. But that said, those drives, are on main highways, like very busy highways. And that's kind of where there are more chargers installed. And where people run into issues if you're driving in those kind of lesser traveled areas. Like I know Alberta's north has been identified as a charging desert.
We have heard from many people that it is a bit of a charging desert. And in, the first episode of this season, we did speak to some Alberta EV owners who do a lot of driving in their EVs. And one person in particular, Chad Irving, had this to say about his experiences on the highways with his EV.
In northern Alberta, there's still a ways to go up here. Edmonton, from basically Calgary is where you get your first true supercharger that's non-Tesla. And all the way to Saskatoon, all the way to Hinton, you're restricted to 50s right now. I'm really hoping that changes, and I'm hoping it changes soon because, these vehicles now are capable, usually 150. My Ioniq is capable of 235 all the way up to 350. But if I'm staying north, I'm slow because the charging stations are up here so far only 50 kilowatts if you're not a Tesla.
So it really just depends on where you are in the province right now.
Yes, if I go south to Calgary, the second I hit Crossroads, there's a Petrocan there that will pull me 235. Once I hit that, it doesn't matter where I go, east or west. Every 80 to 100 kilometers, there are supercharging stations I can fly through with my pick of where I'm charging.
So again, well, right now there is some growth needed in certain areas of our province. As a whole, a cross-Canada trip would give you no problems. But again, it might involve some planning ahead on where you're going to stop. You could hear that full conversation with EV owners Chad Irving and Devin Award in Season 2, Episode 1. And they both actually speak about road trips. They both have gone on EV road trips.
Yeah, and you know what? In Season 1, we also spoke to someone else who went on a road trip with an EV, Jeff Cummings, who is a colleague of mine and Allison. He went on a road trip in the province with an EV in winter. And so that is Season 1, Episode 13. And he offers a really interesting perspective on what that was like because it was also his first time driving an EV.
Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting perspective too because it's, a provincial EV road trip. And I think a lot of people are wondering about that. So, that question of range and distance is one that comes up
probably
a lot.
One of the biggest, biggest concerns people have.
So we did also get a great question from Jerry down in Calgary on that.
I was just wondering where we are with regards to extended distance with a new EV, because I do travel down through the States, and I'm hoping that I'd at some point in time be able to drive like 600 miles on a charge, but that's probably not going to happen.
So first off, Jerry said 600 miles. So that's just, obviously we're Canadians. That's about 965 kilometers.
Yes, that's quite a distance that he's hoping for. But and also with that in mind, let's remember that a tank of gas usually gets a vehicle about 400 miles, which is 643 kilometers of distance. So, it sounds like a lot. But then when we started looking into this, if you look at some of the latest models of EV range estimates, we're actually not as far off as Jerry's question might have sounded.
Really?
Yeah. So I found out, as new models of EVs are released, that range is increasing more and more as the technology improves. Mm-hmm. So this year there was a new model called the Lucid Air EV, and it estimates up to 516 miles of range, which is 830 kilometers.
Which is impressive.
That's a lot.
So, you know what I think an important thing about that too is, we talked a little bit earlier about range loss, particularly in winter, right? You can't really escape winter in Canada.
No, you can't.
So even if you are losing, say, 20% of range in your EV, it's not that bad because you're getting so much mileage out of it anyways.
Yes. Like, and that's the newest and most impressive model out there. Like that's kind of a very luxurious model. But if you look at some of the other models, like I know the Hyundai Ioniq, that's one that's very popular.
Yes.
And its range is estimated at 488 kilometers.
Right.
And then the Tesla Model S is a little bit larger. It estimates 637 kilometers.
Which is still impressive.
Yes.
Still pretty good, right? Like I think that's comparable to a lot of ICE vehicles out there.
Yeah, and when you look at older Tesla models, like the first Tesla had a less range than that because, again, as this technology is improving, so will the range estimates. So basically the short answer to that range question is it varies, but technology is always improving. And as those models are updated, their ranges will probably be updated too.
Yeah. And now let's talk about this hot topic, which is Alberta's electric grid. So we got a really great question from Leo in Red Deer about this. So let's hear what Leo wanted to ask.
I'm Leo from Red Deer. I'm just wondering about the grid. Will it be able to handle all of this new demand that we'll have on our electricity?
So that's such a great question, and one that we've talked about quite a bit on EV Life.
Yeah. Do you think that's probably the most asked question? Like, I think it's maybe a tie between range and the grid, the power
range
grid.
and the grid. Yeah.
Like, as the two biggest concerns that people seem to have when it comes to EVs.
I think that honestly, it's the grid comes up. And even when we were at these car care events in person, we were there and we were chatting with people because we have some questions recorded, but some people we just had conversations with, and the grid came up
a lot,
multiple times every day that we were doing this. So, we have delved into the electric grid and questions about that a few times in these last two seasons of EV Life.
Yeah. And in season 1, episode 9, we spoke with Chris Chapelski, the senior manager of EPCOR's grid transformation. And he explained how the utility is in constant planning when it comes to changes in demand. So let's listen to what Chris had to say.
What we're looking at in EPCOR is how much additional electrical load does that place on the system, and do we need to make any changes or not? So right now, we do support charging. People charge their vehicles in the city of Edmonton. As people adopt more EVs, we'll see that electric load slowly grow. And this is what we do as an electric utility: is we track how much load is being served by the power system, continually evaluating, is the infrastructure sufficient, then make plans to upgrade if we need to. So the kind of growth in the electric load that we can anticipate from EVs isn't something that's abnormal in the history of the power system.
So what Chris basically is saying is that, EPCOR is looking ahead and prepping for this adjustment, this in demand for the grid. EPCOR is just one utility. And so we wanted to make sure or hear from other utilities as well. So we also spoke to a representative from another company, ATCO, during this season 2, episode 5, where we spoke to senior engineer Will York, and he explained how planning is going at that organization.
So let's hear what Will had to say.
We're looking into things like demand side management, like smart EV charging, like behavioral things like educating the customers that, hey, you don't need to charge your electric vehicle between the hours of, 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. when residential circuits are actually the most loaded. And so, we think that some combination of applying all these solutions will help us, defer the capital investments that'll be required to upgrade the grid. And, when you talk about places like California, every electricity system is different. So it's hard to take what's happening there and saying, oh, it'll happen here. One thing I do want to say about electric grids is that since they were created, they've always been growing. If you look at homes that were built, in the early days, they had very small electrical panels because people didn't, have many electrical devices. And then you saw, the introduction of electric furnaces and air conditioners. And then all of a sudden we have 60 amp panels in the 50s and 60s. And then by the 70s and 80s, we have 100 amp panels become commonplace. And now today you see 100 amp and even 200 amp is becoming more common. So, our electricity demand has always grown with our quality of life and technological advances.
So as you can tell from both of these responses, utility companies are working on planning ahead, right? In that episode with Chris, he kind of mentioned things don't happen overnight, right? It's a process. And as more and more people start adopting EVs, the utilities companies will be making those adjustments to make sure that they can meet the demand. And there might be some growing pains, but it's not going to be like one day we wake up and everyone has an EV and our grid is going to be overwhelmed.
No, it was very clear that is not the situation. Essentially, I would say what we have learned speaking to all these companies and organizations, anything, anyone, any entity that is involved in the EV scene, they're all trying to get ahead of where we're at. So everybody's looking a decade, 2 decades down the line, like what are we planning for? And so I would say the information that we're getting from these utilities is that they're planning and they're not worried.
Yes. We, like Allison mentioned, we spoke to multiple utility companies and none of them really seem to be worried. So that's reassuring. Yeah, it's comforting. So let's go to one final question. And this one is from Nazir in Calgary.
I'd like to also hear about what will happen with the batteries eventually and what options are going to be available.
So that is a question I love because we have a great episode that's all about that very topic.
Yeah, we do. In season 2, episode 11, we spoke with environmental engineer Maria Kelleher, who researches the future of EV battery recycling in Canada.
And that one was such an important episode for us because, again, we're talking about all these topics that come up again and again. And the battery recycling.
Yeah, that's a huge one.
Yes, people wonder about. And like, what exactly will happen to these EV batteries?
And so again, in that episode with Maria, she goes into details about how the metals in the batteries are so in demand that there's no way that we're just going to let them go to waste.
Yeah. And the industry is already preparing for that first round of EV batteries that will need to be recycled. Because keep in mind that most people have just started adopting EVs in the last 5 years, likely even less.
So most EV batteries aren't ready to be recycled yet.
They can last up to 20 years.
Right, because they're much like car engines for your ICE vehicle, right? They're really made with the intention that they should last the lifetime of the vehicle.
Yeah, but let's hear a little bit from Maria, that interview we had with her on how that planning is going in Canada.
We do have the recyclers. We have 2 companies that reuse and recondition and repurpose electric vehicle batteries today in Canada, one in Montreal or outside Montreal and one in BC. So I think what needs to happen is happening. The governments are watching electric vehicle batteries. They're doing a lot of research on what's the best way to regulate the management of these batteries.
We were so happy that we were able to meet so many of our members this September and connect with them on EVs and just kind of chat about the podcast. But before we let you go for the season, we do have one additional interview we wanted to share.
Yeah, so alongside the AMA car care events that we attended was also an additional EV event in Leduc this fall, which was hosted by the Municipal Climate Change Action Center. We had them as guests on season 1 of the podcast as well, so they're very involved in the scene. And so while we were there, we were doing kind of the same thing we did at car care, just meeting people and chatting about EVs and hearing questions and letting them know what AMA is doing in that scene. But we also met a very interesting man who is also an AMA member. His name is Howard, and he has a very unique perspective.
Yes, very unique.
Yes.
I'd say like a perspective I haven't heard before. So he's a proud Tesla owner, and he lives rurally. But what was interesting about Howard is he owns a large collection.
He's a car collector.
He's a car collector, right, of ICE vehicles. But I think he mentioned about 4 or 5 years ago, he just wanted a Tesla. And it was the only new vehicle that he's ever bought because he likes to buy these vintage collectible cars. So
he loved his Tesla. So while we were chatting with Howard, we thought it was such a good opportunity to hear that perspective of, a car lover who has traditionally loved ICE vehicles, who lives rurally and now has a Tesla. So I had a little chat with Howard. Let's take a listen to that conversation. So we're here at an event in Leduc for EVs, and I'm speaking to an EV owner. Can you tell me your first name and what EV you have?
Okay, my name is Howard, and I have a Model 3 Tesla. I've had it 4.5 years now, and it looks to be about the best vehicle I've ever owned. It works very well. I keep it on the farm. I live about 20 minutes from Leduc in the country, and I've driven it at minus 31 to Leduc and back, and there was no issues. And it does everything I want it to do. It's my daily driver, and I love the car.
So you live rurally. Do you find that like your neighbors or people you know, do they ever say anything to you, or do you have a lot of like naysayers who have kind of asked you questions about it?
Well, I've taken my neighbor across the road into Leduc to pick up his truck, and he's not an EV lover, but he thought it was okay. There hasn't been too many naysayers in the district where I live, but people in town that I've talked to have said, oh, no, they like the noise, they like the sound of diesel and gas, and I said, well, I like something that's quiet. So there's a matter of opinion, but the car does everything I want it to do, and I've driven down to Lacombe self-driving, and it works very well. I've driven to Westlock. I haven't been to BC yet with it, but you can drive now. There's enough stations along the way that you can drive from here to Vancouver on the Yellowhead. You can drive on the number 1. You've been able to do that for a while.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier, can you tell me a little bit about your kind of charging habits? Like, where do you charge your vehicle?
Oh, yes, I put in a stove plug, which is all you need on the Tesla, and that's 220 charging, so it's level 2, and when I get home I just plug it in and it's ready to go in the morning, and it's never been an issue. It's never thrown a breaker. It just works so well, and the cost to charge it is not very much. It's costing me probably $40 a month, $45 in the summer, and I drive about 750K per month, so my power bill went up about $40 to $45 a month. That's it. In winter, it is more, yes.
What did you drive before you had your Tesla?
Well, I have a pickup truck, and I was using that. I also drive a Rolls-Royce, and that's my everyday car if I need a Rolls-Royce. But the Tesla, when I bought the Tesla, I didn't have to drive the truck into town for groceries anymore. I filled up, well, I didn't even fill my truck up. I put $100 in it. It came up to 3/4. And that's terrible. The cost of fuel now compared to driving an electric car there's no comparison. But for some people, the running out of power, it could be an issue. So you got to think about that.
Is there anything else you wanted to add about electric vehicles or your experience that we haven't already talked about?
Well, it does everything so nicely. It's just, you get in and you're part of the car. It just seems like it's so easy to drive, and it works so well that I don't know. It's just a very good car.
Well, we want to thank you once again for listening to this episode and joining us for another season of the EV Life podcast.
Yes, we have been so happy to be here with our listeners and bring you all these great interviews. And it's been so informative for us too to chat with all these organizations here in Alberta and beyond on what's happening in the EV scene.
Yeah, and even though we're wrapping up this season, that doesn't mean that the conversation needs to end. We do have an EV Life community on the AMA mobile app, and Allison and I are very active in there, along with so many other Albertans who have questions about EVs, or some of them even own EVs and they want to share what their experiences have been like. So make sure you connect with us there. You just download the AMA mobile app anywhere you get your apps and join us in the group.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening to this season of AMA's EV Life podcast.
Thank you.